Hello, everyone, and welcome to Mountain Lake Journal. I'm Tom Halleck. This week, we're sitting down with two of my fellow journalists to talk about what's been making news the past couple of weeks here in the North Country, as well as in Albany and across the state. We'll talk about some of the stories our panelists have been reporting on, and we'll also go a little more in-depth behind the headlines. Joining us this week are Pat Bradley, who is the North Country Bureau Chief for WAMC Public Radio, and Alek LaShomb, who is the Plattsburgh Bureau Chief for WCAX Television. Welcome to you both. Nice to have you.
Hi, Tom.
Let's get started. New York Governor Kathy Hochul delivered her State of the State address this past week, laying out her vision and agenda for the next year. That includes pushing back against the Trump administration's budget cuts, as well as making life more affordable for New Yorkers. The governor once again this year, for a second straight year, focusing on affordability in her speech.
Now the average New York household pays nearly $1,700 per year just to keep the lights on and the heat running.
Hochul outlined planned improvements to affordable housing initiatives and statewide universal childcare.
We're promising universal pre-K for every single 4-year-old by 2028. And this year, we'll pilot community-wide childcare to provide year-round, full-day, affordable care for newborns to 3-year-olds.
The governor then unveiled her budget proposal this week, a record $260 billion budget proposal that Hochul says will expand access to housing, mental health services, and child care at a time when many families are struggling with increases in the cost of living in New York State. Of course, the budget includes many of the governor's policy proposals that will be the focus of negotiations with the legislature over the next several months. The budget does not call for any increase in personal income or corporate tax rates, and it does anticipate having to deal with a cut of more than $10 billion in federal funding. The governor saying her budget plan will lower prices for child and health care, as well as address soaring utility bills and insurance rates, which are among the highest in the nation. So let's break it down. A lot there to unpack. What was the response to the State of the State and the executive budget address from lawmakers up here in the North Country? How did they react?
Speaking with Republican Assemblyman Matt Simpson, of course, budget higher than he wants it to be lower than last year's, saying that, it appears New York doesn't really have a revenue problem, and that's evident from the higher than normal revenues from Wall Street bonuses this year, but saying that it's a spending issue here in the state. So he's not quite sure how, with such a high price tag, that can be an affordability agenda. Also on some of the other topics, childcare being one of them, saying that he would rather see the incentives go more towards families. So any money for childcare to have their kids at home and do it that way instead of establishing new childcare centers.
And Dan Steck also, he for a number of years has complained and criticized the increase in the spending in New York State.
For years he's been saying that New York has a bigger budget than several other states put together. And so his response on this one is rather expected, that it is too high, too much spending. And how can you call it affordable, as you mentioned, Alek? How can you call it affordable when you have so much spending in the midst of what you claim you'll be getting for revenue, when you can't necessarily guarantee many of those revenue streams?
Yeah, and Steck also brings up a projected deficit, and this has been talked about for months now, anywhere from $4 billion to as high as $10 billion. So that right off the bat is something lawmakers will have to deal with. A number of them, the governor and others, point to higher than expected revenues coming into New York. Comptroller Tom DiNapoli saying several million above what was projected, but still, are they not only talking about record spending at the same time that they may be in fact dealing with a deficit?
Yeah, and a lot of these programs that she is proposing, like universal pre-K and child care, it's not a one-time only spending. So while we may have the revenues and the resources this year, what about 5 years in the future?
Yeah, and reaction from up this way, none of these pilot programs are here in the North Country as far as we know, in any of the 3 counties right around the Plattsburgh area.
Right, and to her point too, I mean, with the universal pre-K, this is not something that's going to happen until 2028 for the rest of the state. So if anything, it's a roadmap for us getting there in the state. And that was kind of one of the criticisms of Assemblyman Democrat Michael Cashman, is that the universal child care looks like it's going to be benefiting New York City this year, but what's it doing for the rest of the state? He wants more of an approach that's going to benefit us up here in the North Country, because he doesn't believe it seems to be there quite yet in the budget.
And for Cashman, his priority right now is the rising costs that many people are paying for their utility bills, especially their electric bills. He's beginning his first session. He's a freshman assemblyman taking over for Billy Jones, and already within the first week of the session, he's introduced a few bills that try to tackle the soaring electric bills. Many people you hear are paying nearly twice, if not more than twice, what they have in past years for their electricity during these cold winter months.
Right, and that bill really tackles transparency from the utility companies, but also there's a mechanism that would impose civil penalties if they are to violate anything that's written into the statute. In terms of that getting bipartisan support right now, it seems like Republicans, at least in the North Country, aren't quite on board with that. They think the Public Service Commission already has enough oversight for these things and doesn't need further audits, but it does seem that there is a push for more transparency on that.
No mention of the North Country in the governor's State of the State or budget address.
Outside of the Olympic Regional Development Authority, I think that was really the only real commitment or wish in terms of allocating money towards, really not. It was just more so blanketed programs, housing programs, putting more money in for the pro-housing communities, but nothing specifically targeted up this way.
In the booklet that comes along with it, though, it includes much more.
Yeah, during her speech, she kind of, I want to say, sideswiped some of the North Country things, because she mentioned agriculture, even though it was a statewide thing, but agriculture is a big focus in the North Country. So in some ways it was kind of a side swipe, and I'm like, well, give me more, come on, tell me what, you talk about dairy farmers right now, give me a little bit more here. And to get that, you have to go to what's called the budget book, which details everything. It's 100 odd pages.
100+ pages,
yeah.
And it is much more detailed, and it did include the money for ORDA, $100 million, another $100 million for the Olympic venues in Lake Placid, which was applauded by many, Gary Douglas among them, saying that that's good to keep that funding coming to keep those Olympic facilities in top-notch shape.
And another one too, I guess not in the book, but also mentioned in her address, and this is speaking to what you're saying about farmers, was the $30 million for farmers impacted negatively by the tariff. So that was something that was more broader based, rural areas. I guess not more specifically for the North Country, but with it being such a rural area, I guess you could count that as North Country.
Yeah. And then the governor now has jumped on board supporting an amendment that would allow the state to sell 3 closed prisons in the Adirondacks that are on the state forest preserve land, Mariah Shaw, Camp Gabriel's, and Mount McGregor, a little closer down to Saratoga. Closed prisons that have sat idle for a number of years now. And the governor finally saying, okay, let's start taking the steps that we need to do so that these prisons can be redeveloped.
But regardless, it will take several years because
2 legislatures and then voters
statewide. It's a constitutional amendment, and I think what a lot of people don't realize is because they are on forest preserve land, the entire state has to decide the fate. It's kind of like, 10, 15 years ago, I don't know if you remember, they wanted to do a change to a small cemetery, but it was on forest preserve land, and people were like, why do we have to vote on this? We're 400 miles away from it. That forest preserve land clause in the state constitution really kind of complicates a lot of things.
And Dan Steck, Michael Cashman, Billy Jones would say, hey, we've been talking about this for years.
It may go back as far as Betty Little.
Calling for this amendment and having to do this. And so they're like, well, great that she's finally on board, but they've been calling, and others have been calling for this amendment for for many years now.
Calling, but also passing their own versions of the amendment and their respective chambers for
right.
that. I think last year close to an agreement in both chambers for Mariah Schock, but it never did reach the finish line on that. But I think the question really is, we talk about the forest preserve, the language in that. The question is, was the governor waiting to see how the one at Mount Van Hoevenberg was going to go this last year, because that dealt with the forest preserve. And, with her now putting her weight behind it, giving it some credence, you almost wonder, is that because of seeing that was successful? But that was not without its problems either. We heard from plenty of voters that said this language is very confusing. We're not quite sure what we're voting for.
Right,
here.
exactly. And have we heard from lawmakers from up this way? Are they encouraged by the fact that the governor's now on board with this?
It does seem like, I think the State Senator Dan Steck did put something out after the fact that, yes, encouraging to see the governors finally embracing this. But, we talk about what could these uses be about housing. Well, Mariah Schock, just a year or two ago, they were looking at that for potential mental health, whether that be state facility or, housing for the staff as well. That was something the state explored with the town supervisor, had provided a packet about what is the future of this facility going to be. And yes, to the point of Gabriel's, I think it's beyond repair when you go out there. But with Mariah Schock, the lights are still on, utilities are still being paid. What do you do with that? Do you raise that, or do you use what's already there for something?
We just close these facilities all over the state without a plan to move forward. And I think that's what some legislators and local leaders and such have been calling for a long time. If you're going to do this, have a plan for its future. So hopefully this idea to have the constitutional amendment will maybe push forward some of those sorts of thoughts too.
And I know folks are still reading the booklet just out. We're taping midweek and still trying to get caught up with what all is included in the executive budget. We haven't heard if there's any more prison closings in the budget for this year, that the governor's office and Docs is looking for that.
Not that I saw.
Yeah. And if we go based off last year, the language wasn't included until I think late February,
Later on,
during the Wildcat strikes,
Yep.
right after actually.
Then it came back.
Yes.
None were included, and then all of a sudden the language was back, and then nothing happened. But then the week before Thanksgiving, they announced Bear Hill in Malone closing, and obviously a lot of concern about that. As we've discussed, the Malone community is reeling from that announcement, and that prison will now be closing in just a few weeks in March.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about the stories you both have been reporting on the past few weeks. Now, both of you got to cover a great story. A special night to remember the miracle on ice during the 1980 Winter Olympics. Tell us about that.
Oh, that was cool.
Yeah, wonderful nights. It started pretty early. We got out there for the interviews. They would take us back. There was, of course, three of the athletes from the team: Jim Craig, Michael Ruzzioni, Mark Johnson as well. So we were able to go back there. Original locker room, I believe, as well, where we were doing the interviews. And so it was a lot of waiting and a buildup of excitement, anticipation before the actual event itself. We heard a lot of Go USA chants during the whole time at the Olympic Center. But once you got inside, you could really see the level of producing that went into this event, and yeah, seeing the holograms and the old archival video kind of across the screen on the ice. It was a very cool event.
Still trying to figure out how they did the holograms, because the holograms were on the ice, but occasionally it almost seemed to come out of the hologauze.
Right. That's still a mystery to me, trying to figure that out, is how they did that. And again, I think for me, for both of us being there, the coolest moment was just seeing the video from that time, the narration of the game, of course, the Q&A there at the end with Al Michaels.
Yeah.
The holograms themselves, I think everybody there knew it was just good fun. It's not like you're watching Blade Runner or something to be a hologram like that. It was more more video game based, which was cool.
And talking to the former members of the Olympic team, what are their thoughts on the U.S. Congressional Gold Medal, so that they were all presented, not individually, but the group
They were
medals?
blown away by that. 45 years later, and they get a Congressional Medal of Honor. It's just, I think it's something that, almost inconceivable. It's hard to believe that that happened. And I think they were expressing that too. It's like, we're how old now?
And you got to talk to the hockey players. Where does this rank? I mean, they all went on to NHL careers. Where does this rank for them? Is it still, if not?
Yeah, well, I remember Mark Johnson saying,
memorable.
Of course, the event ages like fine wine. It just keeps growing and growing year by year. I think for Jim Craig, after speaking with him and just knowing about what he did during that tournament, that's probably top for him. Yeah. For the other two, of course, yes, it's something that they're very fond about. Mark Johnson's gone on to enjoy a long coaching career, so I'm sure he has other moments in hockey that he enjoys. But for all three of them, being there that night in that moment is just very special, and of course brought them back to the days when Lake Placid was the center of the world.
And I think too, the audience, when they finished all of the video and the holographic part of it, they brought the three players out to the center of the arena.
Yep.
Kind of take their bow there.
Yep.
And then they walked off the arena, and the announcer introduced Al Michaels. Al Michaels made that famous "Do you believe in miracles?" call. And there had been rumors that he was in the building, but nobody had seen him.
Oh.
And so when they announced him and they brought him out, the audience was like, applauding and cheering. And Michael sat down, and the three players came out. And bonus, you get an interview conducted by Al Michaels with the three hockey players. So yeah, I think it was a really nice way to kind of wrap up and create this nice circle for the evening.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, and of course, Al Michaels getting the last part there for the Q&A and of course making that famous call outs, but Sandy also getting some recognition too with the narration during the whole time. It was him that was narrating the game. They used mostly and kind of had little dashes of Al sprinkled in there, of course, the famous moment, but it was nice to see Sandy get a shot.
Sandy Caligiuri, of course,
Sandy
well-known
Caligiuri,
local broadcaster, and who was also calling the game at the same time. You also reported on a historic discovery in Lake Champlain, a shipwreck.
Yes, very cool find. I mean, just when you think that everything's already been found in the lake, there's always something to be found. So Gary LaFave, of course, sonar specialist, he's been doing this for the last 15 years with his wife, going out on the lake and just what he says is finding targets. So they're just looking for any oddities that are in the water. Came across this in 2019. Strange looking structure, over in Port Kent, Osable Point area. After doing a dive and looking at it, realizing, hey, this is old. This is an old ship. It wasn't until last summer, though, he said that, the United States Navy was out here for a planned project revolving around the Spitfire. There was another top archaeologist with the United States Navy that came over to look at this ship and kind of study it to give him some more insight. And after looking at that, he said, the woodworking with this, just the little, differences in this ship makes it that it could predate Revolutionary War era construction, which makes it very exciting.
Wow.
Very exciting.
That's incredible.
Yeah,
I think that would surprise a lot of people.
Yeah.
And not a warship.
Not a warship, and I tried to get some more insight on that with Chris Saback over at the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum, asking him, he had the chance to check it out with LaFave, so what was his sense of it, and, saying, yes, this does not look like a military ship. It could be a a merchant ship from that time. If that is the case, that would be the first. He says they haven't found any physical remains of ships like that, merchant ships, in the lake. They have documented history in terms of, here are the logs or something, but nothing of the physical structure of a ship.
And of course, shipwrecks are on the bottom of the lake, and there's always the question, do they stay there where they are preserved, the cold water, or are they so historically significant? Do you consider the possibility of raising them and restoring them? And have they talked about that with this ship yet?
Well, because it's in New York waters, the New York Parks Office and Historic Preservation, they'll be tasked with figuring out, hey, do we want to take samples of this? Do we want to raise it, or what are we going to do further? I mean, they can still do monitoring studies around this ship if they want to, but it's The question will be, are they going to approve, hey, let's take a piece of the ship then and actually try to date this back?
Alek, Pat, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Tom.